Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for making the long trek across the road. There's an Australian saying that I would use in this circumstance. Whenever you have to travel a long distance, you need a cut lunch and a water bag. So, thanks for attending. We're pretty happy to be here and talk about this today. This seems to be a subject that's greatly of interest to a lot of people. I had a colleague say that sessions that talked about this at Oracle Open World recently in San Francisco, there's a great amount of interest in that too. So, after lunch, everyone's tired. So, and we're in day 2. So thanks again. Let's just go through please silence your cell phones. I'm not going to skip over this slide. This is sort of important stuff. We're a platinum sponsor of PASS. We support this organisation, in its mission to sort of make sure that we can share and have a community around Microsoft's data platform. So it's really important, if you're able to contribute to that community and participate in it. So go to a SQL Saturday, volunteer to speak at a SQL Saturday. Don't forget to fill in your session evaluations. Whether or not they invite us back next year as speakers depends on whether or not you think that we're doing a good job. So always happy to hear feedback about that. So let me go ahead and introduce myself. My name's Patrick O'Keefe. I run the software engineering organisation for one of the business units at Quest. I've been in software for 25 odd years. I've come from a development background. Most of that has actually been building products around databases or for databases, particularly in performance management and development. I used to say when people ask me what I do, I build software. Now, actually, I'm twice removed from that. So now I build teams that build software. And given that this talk is a little bit about some career stuff, I suppose, or personal and professional development, I feel like I've got a little bit to say about that. As you can tell from my accent, I'm from the deep south in the Pacific, but I do live in the great state of Texas. So over to my colleague here.
Thanks, Patrick. My name is Peter O'Connell, and I'm not local either, as you might take from the accent. I've come from Europe and from Ireland in particular. I've been told by my friends I speak too fast. I've been told by my mother I drink too fast. I've been told by my wife I don't move fast at all. So I'll try to bear that in mind and move along slowly. My background was a software developer way back in the 90s, and I started live programming with SQL Server 6.5 and VB and spent many happy years doing that. And this whole topic kind of resonates with me because I remember being a team in DEC at the time, and when they saw SQL Server coming in and things like SQL Server, they thought the end was nigh for them, and that all the administrators of the DEC systems and the VAC systems at the time, there'd be no jobs for them, and it was going to be a cataclysmic change. And now, over 20 years later, those people are still working now for, I think it's HP, in the same plant in Galway, just doing different things. So I guess, this tipping point that we're all at in terms of the change is an interesting place to be. Okay.
Agreed. So we thought we'd just also make sure that there's a couple of things you understand. If you hear the phrase "straight from the horse's mouth," it means, as we state there, it's not some strange insult. I obviously get to say that little word that starts with M a lot in this country. So in Australia, that mate means your friend, not anything more. So forgive us. Forgive us if we transgress. So what are we going to talk about today? There's a few things. As we've sort of come up with a provocative title for our talk, is the DBA dead or alive? We have a thesis on that. We're basically here to have a conversation about that today. We're going to talk about some mega trends and just go through those and just explore some of that a little bit, and then just talk about what we think is a bright future. So hands up who thinks the DBA as a role is dead? There's a few of you. Who thinks the role is changing? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's as we go through the slides here today, we're going to present some data that we've been collecting. So one of the reasons, and sorry to pass for submitting our presentation so late in the day last week, one of the reasons that this data is fresh off the press. It's results from a survey that we got just last Thursday. And we put out some surveys there to poll what people were doing in their businesses, what's changing their businesses, what's changing their role, and what's impacting the role of the DBA. Some of it is not so much of a surprise. Other bits are interesting, and they certainly provide some context for today. Numbers of DBAs in the organization is, in some cases, decreasing or stable, but what is changing is that the number of databases per DBA is increasing rapidly. We've known this for a long time. But also the number of platforms for the DBAs per DBA is going up quite substantially. So it's getting to the point where those who are looking after just one platform are very much in the minority. Just about 20% of people at this stage touch only one platform. And that's certainly a trend that we've seen consistently grow over the last number of years. And now it's broadening out a bit because it used to be, I just support one other relational platform. And now more typically, the non-relational or cloud platforms are coming into focus as well. The other kind of key things, we asked people what technology trends we expected would change their role most significantly. Top of the list was cloud. Big data was a close second. Automation was there, and of course, automation's always a worry. If you're looking at the peripheral subject matter around this talk, for example, there's some great talks in TED Talks about change over the centuries. There was one example given where in banks and the self-serving to online banking was brought in. And initially, it did result in the closing of a lot of the bank retail outlets across the country, until suddenly somebody figured out, it's now much cheaper to run these particular branches, and they began to open branches again. And the people who ran the branches were just doing different things. So they were doing more substantive roles, like, for example, they were doing selling mortgages and so forth, rather than just processing straight transactions. So automation's always a fear when it happens first, because it does disrupt and it does change, and how it affects our role is going to be significant. Artificial intelligence is one of the more fascinating ones. Machine learning's mixed in there somewhere as well, and it's one that we're going to focus a bit on today.
So to answer our own question, this is what we think. No dead DBAs. So let's get into some megatrends, and probably the first one we're going to talk about is digital transformation.
Right. So we kind of debated at the start whether we'd start with this or not, and I'm delighted to see that actually the next talk that's on in this room is data-driven digital transformation. And we did it because it's a subject close to our own heart, because we're going through quite a few transformations in our own business at the moment. So our idea was, look, let's start with the trends across our organizations, those key trends that are changing significantly the way we do business, and how do these filter down then in terms of how they affect our R&D teams, our database teams, and the technologies we use. So not so long ago, actually quite a bit of a while ago, we started on a path, for example, to take some of our product lines and convert them from standard on-premise products to SaaS products. And to start with, because we're all engineers, we approached this very much from an engineering perspective and looked at the technical challenges that we faced, which were quite significant, and there was a lot of fun stuff in terms of using these new technologies. What we hadn't really anticipated, and we've grown to appreciate over that time, was that we were fundamentally changing other parts of the business. So, for example, now our products are the way people will purchase, right? So we've got billing built into our products. We're affecting finance and billing. Our products are conduits for support, for marketing, for sales. And we're going to talk about DevOps today, and we're talking about development teams working with operational teams. Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because now our R&D teams are pivotal and will be a fulcrum in terms of dealing with each and every function of the business because most of those business functions have to come through our products. And that's really changing us. The other kind of things that are happening, you'll see an explosion of technology and data, and there's tons of really interesting and fascinating statistics out of that. And they're changing both the consumer behavior and the business behavior. So from the consumer perspective, what's happening is technology and data are acting as a catalyst for rapid adoption of technologies. So we'll talk in a moment in terms of the number of mobile devices that will be available in the next couple of years. Just about everybody has a device. Just about everybody is interacting with data on a daily basis. Right? So, and from the business perspective, those same technologies and that same data is acting as an enabler for us to meet that demand. So it's radically changing both the consumer and the business end. So from the consumer perspective, today people expect personalized experiences and they expect choice. Right? I want to buy my product where I want to deploy it how I want to. I want it on whatever device I use most normally. And I want to be able to, when somebody interacts with me, I'm really not interested in talking to you unless you have something interesting to say that's useful for me to do my job. And in terms of the business side, in order to deliver on that, we've got to be extremely agile because we've got to be able to react to what our customers are demanding from us. We have to have the analytics that inform us of this. Right? So it's all very good to say I'll have a personal interaction with somebody based on their experience with my product, but where do I get that data? And how do I manage that data? And how do I respond to it so fast as it's still relevant? And then in order to make all that work and be cohesive, how do I make sure that the person who's interacting with my customer from a support perspective is consistent with what our sales reps are doing or what our R&D function is doing? Everybody has to be in cohesion. And all of that, of course, to do it in volume means high levels of automation. So the other key thing that, and I suppose a penny that dropped with us, is that those changes from customer behavior, they're changing fundamental behaviors. And from a business perspective, it's a fundamental cultural change in terms of how we interact with our customers and all our key stakeholders. Some great examples of that, and there's tons of really good examples of disruptive technologies. But if you look at the likes of Uber or Airbnb, they were in well-established industries, and they brought in new, innovative business models with personalized experiences and delivered in a unique way, and they disrupted industries that had been stable for 20 years.
Yep. So you don't get Airbnb by adding IT to Marriott, right? It's a whole new way of thinking. You don't get Uber by adding IT to taxi companies, right? These businesses are really good examples, actually, of what we mean when we say digital transformation. It's building businesses and business models and ways of interacting with customers around data in a way that's not evolutionary. It's sort of revolutionary.
Great. So, and in terms of SaaS, we spoke about it there. Really in terms of disrupting yourself or the industry, what it means. Well, now everything flows through product and is driven by data and analytics. All our key functions now depend on us. We just had a workshop this week in Seattle where we were talking about some of those dynamics in our own business, and central to it was the IT teams and the IT systems that we're using as key enablers for our business. So it changes the dynamic and is a real opportunity for us to get at the table in our organizations and really influence. It needs new thinking. So don't expect the old ways of thinking to result in that kind of change. It needs, again, transformational and radical change, and we need to put a new hat on and think very differently about the problems we're beginning to solve. So how to prepare? Right, the first thing is agility. Right, the core to what we're doing is the ability to be able to respond and pivot fast. None of us get this right the first time because we're learning and we're adapting, and the environment is changing so radically around us that whatever we know today is going to be irrelevant tomorrow anyway. So we need that agility. And then we need to engage with business stakeholders and take control of the conversation to a certain extent. We're all profoundly affected by what happens in our business and how it filters down in terms of the technologies we use and employ. So being able to influence that at an early stage and understand it better equips us to be able to deal with that situation when it hits. So key thing is look at taking ownership, look at getting into those conversations early, and be proactive about it. Kind of identify areas where a technology enabler can help transform the business in some way.
So our thesis on this is a long way of saying that the trend is your friend, right? So digital transformation is all about data, because that's where all the value is. That's what what companies are building their businesses around, and who stewards the data, right? So as Peter said, it's sometimes this stuff comes down from on high, and one way that we can ensure that we have a voice in the table, as data professionals, is to make sure that we can act as subject matter experts around this stuff. So let's talk about another megatrend, cloud. I grabbed this graphic off the web, and I'm sure I could probably find one for Azure as well. But this is just representative of the growth curve of what is spent on AWS every year. Basically, we're talking about compute ubiquity, right? The availability of cheap compute, right? And why does that matter? Or what's driving that? So in 2020, this is a slide from an analyst at Andreessen Horowitz. If you don't follow his blog, Ben Evans is his name. It's very interesting stuff. But the numbers sort of tell us that back in the heyday of Wintel and desktop PCs, we had somewhere on the order of maybe 1.6 billion desktop PCs deployed. About half of those were in businesses, and the other half are obviously in use in homes. And what's changed since 2007, I suppose, is the introduction of the smartphone. And what this is really just telling us is that within a few short years, every adult and probably every teenager on Earth is going to have a smartphone and internet access and a supercomputer in their pocket. So that's what's driving compute ubiquity. It's also what's driving data ubiquity, right? So again, parabolic curves. More and more and more and more data, right? And again, we're talking about megatrends here and why this is important to us. So more compute devices means more data, more internet usage means more data means more opportunity for data professionals.
Great. In terms of the stats that we saw coming through, 45% of the people we surveyed manage relational databases in the cloud today. About 30% plan to do so within the year. So this time next year, if we're standing here, it'll be about 70% of the people in the room are touching relational databases in the cloud. And then if we look at the split across cloud platforms, you still see that Amazon is still clearly in the lead. However, Azure is eating into that lead very, very rapidly as it becomes a more realistic platform.
I had a question. In the previous slide, you showed more unstructured data. So why would there be an increase in more relational database from next year?
Let me get to that, and why that's important even to people traditionally from relational database backgrounds.
And it's interesting, actually, and I won't go off too much on a tangent because I usually do, but SQL Server or Microsoft this year, their first 2 quarters of the year, they reported substantial increases in their server revenue, and that was underpinned by SQL Server revenue. So SQL Server revenue and sales are on the up again, which is interesting in the context and particularly in terms of the trends. 75% of those surveyed felt the cloud would have a big effect in their role as a DBA. Who manages it? This is kind of an interesting one, because when you look across the categories, DBA, DevOps, external teams, or the vendor, about half is internal, and then it's about a 50-50 split between DBA and people who classify themselves as DevOps or Dev. Looking at that in terms of who decides and who influences what technologies to use, you can see there from the blue that the DBA still has a significant impact in a lot of the key areas. However, there's 2 key areas where we're not so strong, right? So if you look here, and the text is a little bit small, but deciding the solution, the ultimate decision, right, and instantiating the project is still largely out of the hands of the DBA. And that's a real opportunity. That's an opportunity to get in there earlier and, again, take more control before it's kind of out of your hands so much and you're more in the implementation stage. So that's a key area I think we can make a difference.
So what about database as a service? Who here is using Azure SQL DB today or any other form of database as a service? Okay, so a few of you. So how does the role of the DBA evolve in sort of this context? I think there's several important sort of reminders I think we need to remind ourselves of with this stuff. Data stewardship is still required, right? Part of the role of the DBA obviously is to ask the questions that no one else asks, like is the data safe? You know, can I recover it if there's a problem? Is it of high quality? You know, is it all the sort of questions that we ask, right? Physics is still a thing, right? Performance, people's expectations around response times, all of those still exist as problems. The one thing that you don't have to worry about, obviously in Azure SQL DB, quite so much, is if someone fat finger deletes a database, you can get that back with point-in-time recovery, and you didn't have to go set something up for that to occur. That just happens. The good news with that is that leaves you time to concentrate on value, and we'll talk a little bit more about. That's one example of how automation is also your friend, I think. But there are new problems to solve with database as a service. So Peter talked before about this sort of the cloud being a technology driver and also an enabler. So one good example of that in practice is that it's sort of not really all that easy to set up, wide-scale geographical failover, out of the box with SQL Server. Still a lot of manual effort in order to do that, right? With technologies, with database as a service, Cosmos DB is a good example of that. There's Cosmos talks tomorrow. I think there was the keynote this morning was full of Cosmos DB. It's really easy to set that stuff up. But what does disaster recovery mean in that scenario? Right? I think that's still an unanswered question. How do you guarantee security and compliance in those sorts of scenarios? Right? So again, there's a whole bunch of questions or new problems that arise from these new technologies that you didn't have to worry about before, whereas we can leave some of the stuff that we used to worry about behind. Cost management is another one. I was talking to a customer at the booth yesterday, and it was a real aha moment for me in terms of a scenario he was describing around Azure SQL DB, and it was like, wow, you care about sort of this scenario in a way that we hadn't sort of thought about. So that was a good example of this too. Did you want to talk to this one?
Sure. So good news is in terms of cloud and pretty much all the trends we're talking about here today, there is an absolute wealth of really great materials out there, learning materials that's freely available. I've just put 2 links there in terms of Azure and AWS learning paths. And then there's tons, of course, from people like the learning vendors, people like Pluralsight and others have got libraries of really good content in this. So advice number 1 is just get familiar with the cloud offerings and get familiar with the new database platforms, the nature of them. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And become the subject matter expert that can advise and influence the decisions that are being made in the organizations. And experiment with it. There's a lot of opportunity to get free subscriptions and to play with the technology and have a bit of fun. There's a talk tomorrow on machine learning, I think it is, in the afternoon. I met a chap in the bar the other night, and he was telling me about his project where he's uploading data from a drone and getting the drone to fly around and so forth. So he's having a lot of fun in the process of actually getting to grips with this technology as well, and some of it's really, really cool. So it's a chance to start looking at some new stuff as well.
Let's talk about NoSQL. This is a cartoon that came out early this century on fault tolerance. It's a bit of a joke about when NoSQL first came out. You know, SQL obviously is a great language that ubiquitizes access to data. I had to make it family friendly. I was waiting for the chuckle. And all of a sudden, all of these developers were saying, no, you've had it all wrong for 20 years. In fact, you know, we need everything to be web scale. If you've seen that one, that one's definitely not safe for work. But go search for web scale MongoDB on YouTube and put your headphones on. all the developers thought they knew much better, of course, but now in order to get to data, you need to go talk to a developer because they have to write code. So I found this one too. This was pretty cool. So back in the 70s, we're all ISAM databases. We have NoSQL. In the 80s, when Oracle first came about, we know SQL. Then, of course, at the time that cartoon previously in the previous slide came out, it's the developers are the inmates running the asylum. By 2005, it was, well, maybe we do need SQL. So NoSQL is now not only SQL. And now, of course, everybody's press release every other day is, we've added SQL to Spark, and we've added SQL to Dremel, and we've added SQL to everything that didn't have SQL on it before. The point is, yes, SQL, right? So SQL is a valuable skill that all DBAs obviously know. We found out after all of that, what we really wanted was potentially more focused database platforms, right tool for the right job, right? So rather than picking up Oracle or MySQL as just a default choice that we don't have to have a discussion about the individual nature of our storage needs and what the application pattern demands. Instead we just say, well, we'll just pick Oracle or SQL and that will be a fine decision. As it turns out, this is sort of our story. As it turns out, we've found out document databases are very, very useful for certain application types. Particularly if you're doing mostly inserts, it's mostly time series data. You have some pretty well understood constraints about how you want to get the data back, and you care about things like wide geographical availability instead of whether or not you can access it in a relational manner. Eventual consistency is another very valuable compromise. There is no such thing as eventual consistency in SQL Server today. In a platform like Cosmos DB, being able to make those compromises, gives you some functionality you didn't have before. But having said all that, SQL is a very, very useful language that stood the test of time. So those skills are clearly very, very valuable. So getting ahead of this trend, understanding the differences between all the different types of databases. To your point about the unstructured data growing, some of this is structured, some of this could be classified as semi-structured. We'll talk about machine learning in a minute and what I would posit is a new data type. Document, columnar, graph, get familiar with them. Check out Cosmos DB. It's a good example of all this sort of stuff rolled into one easy to learn, sort of easy to understand package, if you like. There's specific use cases that will benefit from these types of technologies. So there's a lot to think about and consider here. We've put some links in there for various types. Again, there's look on Channel 9. HD Insight is another technology that's sort of maybe adjacent to where some of you have been in the past. So it's also all very interesting stuff. Business intelligence is still a thing, right? Every year at these conferences, Microsoft, how much time do they spend in the first day keynote talking about relational engine? How much time do they spend talking about this stuff, right? It's important because, like we said before, even though we're stewards of the data, data is where all the value is, and this is how you get value out of the data. Problem is, every quarter this happens. So this is almost every company, right, particularly here in the US, every quarter someone who looks suspiciously like me goes to someone who looks suspiciously like you and says, can you give me the data because I need to do the thing this quarter. And so what I'll do is you'll give me some data and I'll go put it in a spreadsheet and I'll massage it and do stuff and produce some charts, which I'll then copy out of the spreadsheet, put them into PowerPoint, and then go and present to my boss, who's sitting right there. I wish this was easier, right? This is something that like, and this is a people problem. This is not a technology problem. Because sometimes I can't go to one person to get the data. I've got to get the data from like a person. I have to know which system, which person I have to go to because the data might be in a certain system, and to get the data from another system, I've got to go to a different person. Some of that data might be Google Analytics. Some of that data might be whatever. It's a complicated sort of place to be. So here's another area which I think that we could consider, again, as data professionals, helping connect people to data, right? In your own organizations, looking at your own sort of people issues, and you know, I'm not saying issues in a bad way. I'm just saying how the people work together in your organization. You know, obviously go learn Power BI and related technologies, useful stuff, right? You know, we all use, Peter uses it in different ways to the way I use it, but you know, we're both in the end analysing data to try and understand our parts of the business. But I think more important are the people problems, like the people hurdles, if you like. So anything that you could do in your own organisation to work on simplifying the process of you know, getting data to the people who make decisions makes you a very, very, very valuable part of that process. Right? And then you can be the trusted advisor that's at the nexus of all this stuff. So you can take data stewardship to a much, much more critical sort of layer into the organisation.
I think as well some great examples of that in terms of how we cross-correlate our data. I mean, how many times have you seen either a marketing department or a support department or whatever look at their data in isolation and come up with completely the wrong interpretation of it? You know, so we see some trend and fall off in interest or some drop in customer satisfaction, and it's because the product doesn't have this feature, or it's because somebody has done something wrong here, and nobody's joining the dots and looking at things like usage telemetry from products and connecting it with campaigns that were done by marketing, or you know, it's getting that holistic view and bring it from all those disparate different data sources and then putting analytics on top. That's what brings it to life and makes it useful. And that again is where puts our data stewards in a pivotal situation in terms of enabling the organization.
So let's talk about machine learning. So machine learning is clearly about making compute smarter, right? I think it's usually, in a lot of the examples that we see today, it's highly useful but almost invisible when it's done well, right? You are using machine learning as part of workflows of products that you just use every day, right? Every time you go to Google, that's machine learning. I've used the GAFA. Anyone's familiar with that? Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, right? It's built into their businesses. This is not going to happen, right? But it does creep in lots of different ways. So this is an example of computational photography, right? It just happens to be from Apple's feature in, I think it was introduced last year in their dual lens phone. The difference between these two images is this one has this depth of field effect, right? Where around the subject's face, she's sort of, everything's blurred. That's all done using a neural net. And it's all pretty complicated. But you don't care about that. It's a nice photo, right? And you know, similarly, Peter, you found this one the other day too.
Yeah, and actually the video that's linked here that goes back to I think 2013, but is an example of Microsoft with Skype and combining speech recognition. But what's really cool about this is that the speaker is speaking English, it's recognizing his voice, and then it's translating it to Chinese and speaking back in Chinese. Some pretty cool technology to do that, and that's all is driven by machine learning. I didn't even know this existed because I went on Skype when I was researching this, and Skype has this feature at the moment and supports 4 languages. I think there's English, French, Italian, not sure what the other one is. I think they're going to add Australian soon as well. Be a relief to us all. So again, it's just an everyday practical use. Now, it's still quite laggy and so forth, but you can see where this is going and what a dramatic effect that would have once that starts to come to life. So it's exciting stuff when you see these things come to life. And of course, then there's self-driving cars, for example, and many, many other really good examples of machine learning.
Yep. So why is this important to you guys and to us, I suppose? So machine learning needs training sets, right? And in the particular example, or the two particular examples we talked about, so computational photography and speech recognition, right? Both of the data types involved in that, because machine learning is largely a classification exercise, right? Both of the data types involved in that are complex data types or unstructured data types, which is sort of back, hopefully, to answer your question. New types of data, right? So that's why we're seeing this unstructured data growth, right? It's photographs, it's audio, it's video, it's social media messages, right? It is so easy, and we'll talk about this in the next slide here. In terms of preparing for machine learning, we've put a few things there. Learn R, learn Python, right? They're the lingua franca of machine learning today, right? You may have heard of Jupyter Notebooks that's built into Azure Machine Learning experience on the web. So, and also those technologies are built right into SQL Server today, right? So there's plenty of documentation and plenty of stuff on Channel 9 and all the usual sort of places you can go to find out about this stuff. Azure Machine Learning is a very interesting way to learn this too. If you have an Azure subscription or an MSDN, you can go straight up there today and you can start playing around with it, right? There's the what they call the cognitive services built into Azure. So all the more complex stuff, right? For those of you who are fans of the Silicon Valley show on HBO, last season they did the hot dog detector. You could build that today in like 2 lines of code because there's an image recognition service as a service built that you can get on Azure today. You can get language interactive something. LUIS is the acronym, and it can do speech to text conversion, and it can also do chunking of text. So you can go build a bot with it, right? So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can do. And again, why is this important to you? You're all data stewards. There'll be requirements to store and manage these types of data to support these types of features in the applications that your companies build, right? Good way to, become learned about this stuff.
And again, in terms of having fun on this at home, I think you have it here, Code Dojo for kids. This is coding classes for kids. My kids go to it every Saturday, but our local Code Dojo is using machine learning for robots that are fighting. So it's just some kind of really cool, fun things you can do with it too.
Yep. So this comes from a talk I did a long time ago on DevOps, and I thought we just have a little bit of a talk about this again because some of this is sort of folds into not so much technology issues, but people issues. So DevOps is obviously the contraction of development operations, and DevOps is basically a culture where those two roles appear on the same team. And why is that important? And I say roles because there are sort of two roles. Clearly there's a spectrum. But the developer roles or devs tend to be aspirational focused, right? They want to go and make something new. They want to build something. Create gains is the way they think about stuff. Whereas operations people, they don't want anything to break, right? They're all about risk and preventing failure, right? So I don't know, but who amongst you would sort of identify as more on the developer side of stuff? I know I do. What about operations? Yeah, well, that's expected, right? You're all DBAs. And then part of the technology part of DevOps. So that was the people part of DevOps, and the technology part of DevOps. Which I think actually is less important than the people part because DevOps is all about a cultural shift. We used to have waterfall where we'd pretend that we knew what date we were going to ship something and we pretend to all commit to that date. And then we had Agile, which was just basically waterfall with a daily meeting. Right? But the important bit is here, right, where after the development finishes, right, so this bit's Agile, and then you have this, I'm going to hand it over to somebody to go and operate, right? And in a DevOps culture, what makes the technology stack at Uber and Airbnb different is that they do it in this continuous delivery sort of mode, right? Where there's no separate step to go and operate, the team goes and operates it, right? I have a friend who works from Amazon, and that's what they do, right? The team owns, their two-pizza team owns everything soup to nuts, from development through to operations. The advantages, why people do this and why companies do this, it's pretty simple, right? A couple of things. One is time to market is much, much quicker, right? You're making small changes all the time, so the cost to change direction or pivot, right, by definition is going to be, if you shipped yesterday and then ship again today and find out you did something wrong, it's a lot less costly to undo a day's worth of work than it is to undo 9 months of work. Way back in waterfall days is what used to happen. And the other thing, it's basic complex systems risk management, right? It's far less risky to make lots and lots of small serial changes than it is to make one big set of changes.
Great, and again, the data in terms of what we collected is consistent with the trend. I always find the discussion on DevOps and SQL Server kind of interesting because I can never remember a time where we had clearly delineated roles between development and DBA in the teams I work with. Typically, the DBA tended to be the person who wasn't looking at their toes when somebody asked who's going to take care of this database when it goes into production, especially in the early days until it started getting bigger and bigger. I spoke to and interviewed a couple of people in the lead up to this. I talked to one chap in particular, and he was telling me that in his company now, because it's purely a DevOps culture, he's no longer able to call himself a DBA. So I said, oh, right, that's interesting. He says, what do you call yourself? He said, oh, I'm a DevOps engineer now. I said, that's fascinating. And what do you do differently? I said, nothing. So it's some of this is kind of a little bit of a rebranding exercise, and I guess that's been over cynical, of course. It is changing, and the interaction changes, but it's a tweak in some cases. But it's still, for a lot of organizations, it's still early days, and of course that's consistent with those kind of cultural behavioral changes always take an awful lot longer than just pure technology changes, because they're changing people and process and systems and trying to get everybody to overlap. And cloud is making it much easier because it's making some of the technologies around continuous integration and so forth much easier. It's allowing us to spin up other environments and so forth much easier and much more cheaply. It's an enabler again. So again, a good example again of how these megatrends are overlapping and conspiring to drive change a little bit faster. And in terms of getting there, same as you start with the basics. You kind of learn about DevOps and educate your stakeholders. Don't try and boil the ocean and convert the whole organization all in one go. Hand select a couple of projects that are small and easy to manage. Get your core processes up and going. Select, being careful and slow to choose any systems that might automate stuff. And of course, you only automate it when you've got your process up and going, otherwise you just get faster at doing a bad thing, right? So automation is great when you're there. And then measure it, monitor it, and learn from it, and keep pivoting and changing until you get it right. And then begin to think about pushing it across your organization. But Patrick's team has been quite successful in doing that over the last, 2 years it's taken now.
Yep. Yep. It does take a long time, again, because it's a people, right? It's a cultural shift. You have to. Some of the developers, like back to my tug of war slide there, some of the developers on that I just want to go build stuff have to accept some constraint, and then some of the people on the operations side who are maybe a little bit more resistant to change, and for good reason, they need to perhaps live a little and take a little risk. So dogs and cats need to live together. We talked about compute ubiquity before, so I thought we'd come back and talk about automation just a little bit more specifically. So we think that automation is going to take care of all the boring stuff, right? Why should you need to worry about actually going and configuring a backup and recovery cycle, for example? Like, why can't you just say, I want to make sure that if something goes wrong, I can recover in this amount of time, and it will just magically go and happen for you, right? I mean, that's what we'd like to get to. So it's the DBA version of self-driving cars. So why do we want to automate? And this is the thing, I think, this word here is the important bit, you, right? Because you need to scale you, and you need to diversify you. So the way you do that, right, in an environment where, you know, the first slide we opened with almost was more data platforms, less DBAs, more databases. So how do we combat that? We just have to automate stuff. Because the reason we want to do that is that it means that aside from its boring work, right, it means it frees you up to do more stuff, to do high value stuff, to more interesting stuff, right? All of the stuff we've been talking about of how to get ahead of these trends will do you no good at all if all you're doing all day is fighting fires, right? So let's talk about self-tuning databases for a minute, right? In the keynote yesterday, Microsoft, various people demonstrated really cool feature in Azure SQL DB where it reads stuff out of the query store and or the query performance store and applies machine learning models to things, and then will automatically change the query plan and make a query run faster for you. Great. Means you don't have to do it, right? That's good, right? We just go on and do something else that's more interesting, right? And you know, you might say even for a vendor like us who you know sells performance tuning product, are we worried? No. I'll tell you why we're not worried. Oracle announced the same thing. You know, it's good. It's like the next generation of the optimizer, right? So it's the sort of thing that you would want your SQL optimizer to do if it had infinite time and infinite resources. The problem is that the SQL optimizer, when you submit a type of query in and run it, it's pretty time bound, right? It's serial inside. It's serial to you wanting to get your data set back. So context is everything, right? The one thing the automated query plan swapper that Microsoft demonstrated yesterday can't do is it has no idea about whether or not the output of that query was actually valuable in an application context. Like only humans can do that. It's like, yep, we made that 4 billion row scan as efficient as we possibly could by changing the plan to this one. Great. But no one's, people only want one row out of it. They don't want the 4 billion rows, right? So the automatic tuning is not going to tell you that, right? Humans are going to have to do that. And they can't fix certain usage semantics like where you have multiple systems interacting together, right? So we're still going to need to have humans look at this stuff, right? And we're seeing this even here. Here's another survey result that shows there's a pretty large amount of low-hanging fruit in automation. So all that orange bar there is all the stuff that's not yet automated that people like you told us last week, right? So that feels like that's a fairly large proportion of our collective time that we could recover if we could just get computers to do that stuff instead of humans for the stuff that the computers are actually good at. So again, our theme here, the trend is your friend, right? Automating all the boring stuff means you get to work on the real problems. And the other side of that coin is that you can make yourself indispensable by being able to do stuff that computers can't do. And there's plenty of stuff that computers can't do. So let's bring it home.
Sure. So I think just on the automation piece as well, there's my colleague Pina DeBasque, who's in Oracle, was awarded an Oracle Ace just a few weeks ago at Open World, was telling me about the Larry Ellison talk where Larry was talking about an Oracle Cloud that is going to be self-tuning, self-maintaining, no need for DBAs. And I rang Pina after that and said, oh, God, this sounds major, you know, is this true? And he said, well, he was at Oracle Open World about 10 years ago and they were saying exactly the same thing. And somebody else reminded me that SQL Server 2005 is going to do this too. So it's a kind of a recurring theme, isn't it? It's just, we might automate one thing, but the problems change, and we end up doing something else. The other kind of interesting caveat to it as well, especially when you start getting into cloud, if you've got somebody like Oracle Cloud who's doing auto-tune for you, one of the solutions may be, oh, look, you're running out of resource, let's provision more for you. So who's going to trust Mr. Ellison to actually do that when you're actually paying the bills?
At heart, right.
I'm sure he would, but there you go. So there's a kind of a conflict of interest there as well. And the discussion we had with somebody in our booth yesterday just really hit home for us. The cost management when you go into cloud becomes a massive issue. So how do you optimize the plan, the pricing plan? It's almost like going to buy a mobile phone right now. The plans are very complex and convoluted, and they change from one cloud vendor to another, and you've got different tiers. So how do you maximize usage in a particular tier before you go to the next one? How do you know you should go from one tier to the other? That's just going to blow into a huge issue, and is, for companies to manage. And again, somebody needs oversight of that. Somebody needs to watch and police it, and somebody needs to make sure that your cloud vendor doesn't run away with your cash. They would. So a lot of this is kind of, again, when we start automating those tasks out, when we start participating in major change, how can we move from a more operational focus to a more strategic one, get involved in those discussions, start steering the technology choices by virtue of the fact that we understand our business changes more? How can we participate and drive that adoption? So just embrace it. Don't stop resisting it or fearing it. Get involved and turn it into a virtue. And then have some fun with stuff like machine learning and really start rediscovering some new technologies and some exciting technologies, and keep learning. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep contributing, which I think is a pretty good thing for you, Patrick.
Yeah, so investing in yourself is probably the best thing you can do, right? Spend some time. Try to. I mean, that was my point about the automation stuff. Is find some time to free up some time to spend in, learning and growing. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. Start a blog, right? Speak publicly. SQL Saturdays. We talk about pass. SQL Saturdays are a great opportunity to get in front of your peers and start sort of. Because I can tell you nothing crystallizes your thoughts or helps crystallize your thoughts more on a particular subject than having to put together a 65 slides on it, right? So that's a really, really good way to help grow yourself. Mentor others, right? If you can learn it yourself, you can teach others. You can spread the knowledge, right? Contribute to open source if you have a development bent. That's another good way to get involved and start branching out, right? A lot of the stuff, particularly around machine learning, is all open source. And don't forget there's lots and lots of options. We talked a little bit about our backgrounds with some humour before, but I started as a developer. I don't do development every day, right? I've sort of done a lot of different things and worked in some different companies in my career, right? So you don't have to stay in the same job all the time. Peter's very, very similar. Now he's in product management at a developer at a software company, right? So there's lots and lots of different ways that you can go as a data professional, and we've listed a few there.
And you don't necessarily have to regress into an executive role.
No,
I would actually do something
I would
useful.
advise against it.
And there's a ton of options. I mean, if you rewind a couple of years ago, it's kind of, will I be a DBA or a developer, or maybe manage a team? Now look at the options, right? There's DBAs, there's development, there's machine learning. Maybe I might go back to university and go towards data science. There's NoSQL, there's cloud. There's managing all that cloud infrastructure, analytics, BI. There's just a wealth of different opportunities there. And all of those opportunities are very high value and quite happily very highly paid and remunerated. So there's a ton of opportunity there if you look around and start learning and start experimenting in these new areas.
Thank you very much. Please don't forget to fill in your session evaluations.
Yeah, and just actually one other thing, there's a survey we're doing in conjunction with PASS. There's a day left in it. We'd really appreciate it if you respond. It's purely looking at the role of the DBA. There's nothing product or company focused in this whatsoever. It's just purely looking at DBA trends, and we'll be giving the data to PASS in order to use to establish kind of supports and learning.
Help drive programs sort of within PASS.
How do we do that?
It's on the PASS site.
If you go to pass.org.
Yeah. Thank you very much.